Smoke curled from a stovepipe over a kitchen that fed 12 men and earned nothing. A woman in a travel-worn dress stood in the doorway of a Wyoming ranch house, counting the gaps in the floorboards, the cracks in the ledger, the holes in everyone's hope. They had bought her to cook. By winter, she would own a piece of the future. 3 weeks earlier, a railroad agent had told Adeline Burke something she would not forget. "Folks see a kitchen," he'd said, tipping his hat at the depot in Omaha. "They see supper. Smart folks see a storefront." She had laughed then, a tired woman with a single trunk and a marriage contract folded in her glove. But the words stuck like a burr. A kitchen was only a kitchen until someone decided it was something more. She intended to be that someone, wherever the train carried her. The train carried her to Bitterroot Junction, a smear of buildings on the high plains where the wind never rested. Adeline Burke gathered her trunk and stepped onto a platform of warped pine, scanning the faces for the man whose letters she had answered. Caleb Hartley was not hard to find. He was the only one not smiling. Tall, sun-darkened, with a jaw set like a fence post, he held his hat against his chest more from habit than welcome. "Miss Burke," he said. "Wagons this way." The ride to the Hartley Ranch took 2 hours over rutted ground. Caleb spoke 11 words the entire trip, and 4 of them were about the weather. Adeline used the silence to study everything: the thin cattle, the sagging barn roof, the dust that lay over the land like a verdict. The ranch house surprised her. It was larger than she expected and emptier than she feared. A long table dominated the main room, scarred from years of elbows and tin plates. Beyond it, the kitchen sprawled, a great cast-iron stove, a dry sink, shelves of mismatched crockery. And everywhere, the evidence of feeding many men badly. 12 hands, Caleb said, setting her trunk down. They eat at dawn, noon, and dusk. Beans, mostly. Salt pork when there's pork. He looked at her as though measuring whether she might break. "My first wife passed 2 winters back. The men have cooked for themselves since." Poorly, Adeline removed her gloves. "I gathered that from the smell." Something flickered in his face. Not quite a smile, but the place a smile might one day grow. "Supper's your charge starting tomorrow. The hands are rough but decent. Don't expect thanks. They don't have it to give." That evening she met them. Weathered men named Pike and Russ and Old Henry, a boy called Tully who couldn't have been 17, and 8 others who blurred together in flannel and fatigue. They eyed her the way men eye weather they can't change. "A bride with a frying pan," Pike muttered, loud enough to be heard. Caleb finally found a way to make the beans worse. The men laughed. Caleb said nothing. Adeline smiled pleasantly, and said nothing either. But that night, by candle stub, she opened the ranch ledger she'd found beneath a stack of unpaid bills. The numbers told a story crueler than any of the men's jokes. The Hartley Ranch was 3 seasons from ruin, and supper, she suspected, was only the beginning of what was wrong. The numbers would not let her sleep. By lamplight, Adeline traced columns down the page and found waste in every line. They bought flour by the half-barrel and let mice take a third of it. They ordered coffee that arrived stale, because no one negotiated the freight. They butchered cattle they could have sold and sold cattle they should have kept. But it was the figure at the bottom that made her sit upright. Beside the column for the railroad camps, the survey and grading crews laying track 10 miles north. Someone had scrawled a note in Caleb's blocky hand. "They got no cook. Pay $1 a plate for hot food. Too far to bother 10 miles. $1 a plate. 40 men in a grading camp 3 times a day." Adeline closed the ledger softly, her heart drumming. Too far to bother, he'd written. She intended to bother. But intending and doing were separated by a husband, a kitchen she did not yet command, and 12 men who thought her a joke. She rose before dawn and made breakfast. Proper biscuits, eggs fried in clean grease, coffee she'd salvaged by roasting the stale beans a second time over low heat. The men ate in startled silence. Tully had 3 helpings. Even Pike, who had named her the bride with a frying pan, wiped his plate with a biscuit and said nothing, which from Pike was a standing ovation. Caleb lingered after the others rode out. That was a good breakfast. It was an ordinary breakfast made with attention, Adeline said. I'd like to talk to you about the ledger. His face closed like a barn door. The ledger's ranch business. I'm your wife. By the contract we both signed, the ranch is my business too. She set down the coffee pot. You wrote a note about the railroad camp. 40 men with no cook paying $1 a plate. I wrote that in a low moment. It's a fool's idea. He pulled on his gloves. I can't spare a single hand for cooking schemes, and I won't have my wife driving a wagon 10 miles to a camp full of strangers. It isn't done. Many things aren't done until someone does them. Adeline. He said her name carefully the first time he'd used it. I arranged for a cook and a wife. Not a merchant, the men already laugh. If you go peddling plates to railroad crews, they'll laugh at me too. And a ranch boss can't be laughed at and keep his men. Do you understand? She did understand. That was the trouble. She understood his pride, his fear, the way 2 bad winters had taught him, that reaching for more usually meant losing what little remained. She understood that he was not cruel, only cornered. For 2 days, she said nothing more. She cooked. She watched the flour barrel and the freight bills, and the way old Henry pressed a hand to his bad back when he thought no one looked. She watched Caleb ride out at dawn and return at dark, with his shoulders an inch lower each day, doing the arithmetic of survival in his head and coming up short. On the third night she found him at the table, the ledger open, his face in his hands. The bank wants payment by spring, he said, not looking up. I've got cattle worth half what I owe, and no way to make the difference. Adeline pulled out the chair across from him. Then let me try the thing you called a fool's idea. What is there left to lose? Caleb was quiet a long while. Then he laughed, a short, broken sound with no humor in it. Nothing, he admitted. There's nothing left to lose. That's the truth of it. Then I'll need the wagon Thursday, Adeline said, and Tully to drive while I cook in the back. And I'll need you to stop the men from laughing long enough for me to fail or succeed on my own terms. And if it ruins us faster, then we'll be ruined faster, and you can tell the bank you let your wife try. She held his gaze. But I don't intend to fail, mister. Hardly. He studied her as if seeing a stranger who'd worn his wife's face all week. Caleb, he said finally, if you're to gamble the ranch, you'd best use my name. It was Tully who became her ally first. The boy hitched the wagon Thursday with a nervous eagerness that told its own story. My ma cooked for a boarding house in Cheyenne, he confided as they jostled north. Before she got sick, she used to say there's no honest work that's beneath a body. Only work folks are too proud to be seen doing. She sounds wise, Adeline said. She was. Tully flicked the reins. Everybody here thinks small, ma'am. Survive the winter, survive the next. You're the first person I ever heard talk like there's a next year worth planning for. Adeline smiled. There's always a next year, Tully. The trick is being ready for it. The grading camp sprawled across a cut in the prairie like an anthill someone had kicked. Tents and tools and 40 men breaking earth for the railroad's slow march west. Adeline had spent 2 days preparing. In the back of the wagon, she'd built a working kitchen, a sheet-iron camp stove banked with coals, kettles of stew lashed against the jolting, crates of biscuits wrapped in clean cloth to hold the heat, and tins of dried apple hand pies that filled the whole wagon with cinnamon. She had calculated everything. 40 men, the foreman had told Tully when the boy rode ahead to ask. $1 a plate was steep for a single meal, so she'd priced it at 75 cents for a plate of stew, 2 biscuits, and a hand pie. Generous, hot, and so small fortune better than the cold beans the crews choked down between shifts. The foreman, a broad man named Dietrich with a German accent and a perpetual squint, walked the length of the wagon with his arms crossed. You drove 10 miles to sell us supper. I drove 10 miles to sell you the best supper you've had since you left home, Adeline said. The first plate is free. If your men don't like it, I'll turn around and you've lost nothing. Dietrich's squint deepened. He was a man accustomed to being sold things he didn't want. But the smell, the stew rich with browned beef and onion, and a secret spoon of molasses, the biscuits steaming, the cinnamon. The smell was an argument no skeptic could refute. He took the free plate, ate it standing up, and was quiet for the length of the meal. Then he turned to the camp and bellowed, "Food wagon! 2 bits a plate for the company, 4 bits comes out the rest. Form a line and mind your manners, you've got a lady cooking." The men came. Of course they came. Adeline ladled stew until her arm ached, and Tully made change from a cigar box, and the line of grating men, homesick, half-starved for anything that tasted of a kitchen rather than a chuck pot, emptied her kettles in 90 minutes. She sold every plate. She sold every biscuit. She sold every last hand pie, and 3 men offered to buy the next day's pies in advance, pressing coins into Tully's hand before she could so much as nod. When the wagon rattled home that night, Adeline counted the cigar box twice to be sure. Even after Dietrich's company subsidy and her costs, she had cleared more in one afternoon than the ranch kitchen spent in a week. Caleb was waiting on the porch when they returned, his face unreadable in the lamplight. She climbed down, stiff and smelling of wood smoke, and set the cigar box on the rail beside him. "Count it," she said. He counted it. His hands went still. He counted it again. He stopped. "In one day? In one afternoon. And they want me back tomorrow. Dietrich says the company will pay the difference to keep the men fed and happy. Fed men work faster, and the railroad pays him by the mile." She let herself smile. "It seems your fool's idea had a business hiding inside it." The next morning the laughter started up again, but with a different edge. Pike leaned on the corral rail as she loaded the wagon. "Off to feed the railroad, are we?" The bride with the frying pan turns peddler. "What's next, Mrs. Hartley? You going to sell the boss's saddle off his horse?" "Only if the horse can spare it," Adeline said sweetly, and old Henry barked a laugh that surprised them both. She went back the second day and the third. She learned the rhythm of the camp, when the shifts changed, which men wanted seconds, that the timekeeper had a weakness for anything with apples in it and would pay double. She learned that Dietrich's crew was only one of 3 working the line that spring, and the other 2 camps had no cook either. Each evening she came home and added to the cigar box, and each evening Caleb counted it with a face that did less and less to hide his astonishment. By the end of the first week, the box held more money than the ranch had seen since the autumn cattle sale. By the end of the second, Adeline had stopped offering free plates because her reputation arrived ahead of her wagon, and men from the neighboring camp walked the extra mile on their own legs to stand in her line. She was not a bride with a frying pan anymore. She was beginning to be something the High Plains had no name for yet. But she had a name for it. She'd had it since Omaha. A storefront on wheels and a woman smart enough to see it. By the third week, the operation had outgrown a single wagon and a borrowed boy. Adeline sat at the long table one night with the ledger, her ledger now by silent agreement, and laid the problem out for Caleb like a hand of cards. 3 camps, roughly 120 men between them, and I can reach maybe 40 before the food cools. I'm turning away money. I've been turning it away for a week." Caleb leaned over the page. He had taken to doing that, leaning in rather than shutting down. The change had crept up on them both. "What do you need?" "A second wagon, a second stove, and cooks. I can't be in 3 places, and I can't keep Tully driving while I ladle." She tapped the column where her profits sat in a fat, growing tower. "I can afford it. That's the strange part. The money's already here to spend, so they built it." Caleb, who could mend anything with hands and baling wire, rigged a second camp stove into the old buckboard. Adeline hired help from the unlikeliest place, the ranch itself. Old Henry's back couldn't take a full day in the saddle anymore, but it could take a day at a camp stove, and he turned out to have a gift for biscuits that he'd been hiding under 40 years of cowboy gruffness. A widow named Mrs. Sayer from Bitterroot Junction, who'd been taking in washing to survive, signed on to bake pies in the ranch kitchen by the dozen, then the gross. The ranch began to hum in a way it hadn't in years. The smell of baking drifted from the kitchen at all hours. Wagons came and went on a schedule. Adeline chalked onto a slate by the door. She negotiated directly with the railroad's regional supply agent, the same sort of man who'd told her at the Omaha depot to see a storefront where others saw supper, and arranged to buy flour and beef and dried fruit by the freight load at prices that made her grin, then turned around and sold hot meals to the railroad's own crews at a tidy margin. She was buying from the railroad and selling to the railroad and pocketing the difference, and the symmetry of it pleased her enormously. Caleb watched it all with the dazed expression of a man who'd planted potatoes and grown gold. One evening, he found her recalculating freight costs by lamplight and simply stood in the doorway a while. "My first wife was a good woman," he said at last. "Kind. She kept a clean house and a fine table, and she never once looked at that ledger. I loved her for the home she made," he paused. "I never thought a wife could be a partner in the business of the thing. I didn't know to ask for it. I'm not sure I'd have known what I was asking for." Adeline set down her pencil. It was, she understood, as near to a declaration as Caleb Hartley had in him, and it was a fine one. "You arranged for a cook," she said gently. "You got a cook. You just also got everything she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to let her be." The men came around slowly, then all at once. The turning point was payday, the first one in 2 years that Caleb met in full and on time, with a small bonus besides, drawn entirely from the cigar box that had become a strong box that had become a proper account at the Bitterroot Bank. Pike took his pay, counted it, and looked at it a long moment. Then he took off his hat, actually took it off, and held it the way Caleb had held his at the depot, like a man unsure what to do with his own hands. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "I called you a bride with a frying pan. You did. I was a fool." He turned the hat. "My sister's a widow over in Lodgepole. Cooks like an angel, got 3 young ones and no way to feed 'em. If you ever need another hand at the stove, send for her," Adeline said. "Tell her to bring her own apron and her best recipes. I'll find the work." The whole bunkhouse heard it, and the whole bunkhouse understood what it meant. The bride with the frying pan was hiring now. She had crews and routes, and a name that traveled the rail line faster than the trains. Tully, promoted to head driver, had taken to introducing her to new foreman as Mrs. Hartley, who feeds the whole Western line, and not one foreman had laughed. For the first time since she'd stepped off the train, Adeline let herself believe the thing she'd suspected in Omaha. Not just that she could survive, that she could build. The numbers said so, and the numbers had never lied to her yet. But numbers, she would soon learn, were not the only force on the high plains. And the man who held the largest of them had begun to take notice of the woman feeding his railroad. He arrived in a black coach with brass fittings, a man too well dressed for the prairie, and he introduced himself as Mr. Sloan, Regional Contracts Manager for the railroad company. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, declining the chair she offered, "you've been feeding 3 of my grading camps. Doing it well, by all accounts. The foremen sing your praises." He smiled without warmth, which is precisely the problem. You're operating on company property, selling to company men without a company contract. We can't have independents skimming the line. Adeline kept her face calm, though her stomach dropped. "I've been told my cooking improves your crew's productivity." "It does." Sloane's smile thinned, which is why the company intends to take it over. "I'm here to offer you a buyout, a modest one, and to make clear it isn't really a choice." The figure Sloane named was an insult dressed as a courtesy. He laid it on the table like a man laying down a winning card, certain of the game. "That's a fraction of what the operation clears in a month," Adeline said. "It's a fair price for a woman with no contract and no standing," Sloane replied. "You've been operating on goodwill, Mrs. Hartley." "Goodwill," the company extended, "and the company can withdraw. One word from me and every foreman on the line is forbidden to buy a single plate from you. Your wagons turn back full. Your investment, the stoves, the wages, this charming little enterprise, spoils on the prairie." He pulled on a glove. "Or you take my offer, and you've at least got something to show for your trouble." I'll give you 3 days to be sensible. He left in his brass-fitted coach, and the dust of it hung in the air long after. Caleb's jaw was tight enough to crack. He can't do that. Forbid the men to eat? He can forbid them to buy on company time at company camps, Adeline said slowly, working it through. And that's where my whole business lives. He's right that I have no contract. I built this on a handshake with Dietrich and the simple fact that nobody official was paying attention. Now someone is. That night she did not sleep, but for the first time it was not from excitement. She spread every paper she had across the long table. The freight agreements, the supply receipts, the slate of routes, the fat ledger, and she searched them for a weapon. She found mostly the proof of her own vulnerability. Sloane had named it exactly. She was an independent on borrowed goodwill, and goodwill was the cheapest thing a company could revoke. The next morning, the squeeze began in earnest. Dietrich rode out to the ranch himself, hat in hand, miserable. Sloane sent word down the line, he said. Company men aren't to buy from your wagons. Effective today. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartley, I argued. The men near rioted. But it's my job on the line if I let you in the gate, and I've got my own little ones to feed. He would not meet her eyes. Your stew kept us going all spring. I won't forget it. But I can't take a plate today. She watched her primary camp close to her like a gate swinging shut. 40 men. The heart of the operation. Gone in a sentence. The other two camps fell the same day. By noon, Adeline had 2 fully loaded wagons, a kitchen full of pies, a payroll of 5 people counting Mrs. Sayer and old Henry and Pike's widowed sister who'd arrived from Lodgepole only the week before with 3 children and a trunk of recipes, and nowhere to sell a thing. The food would spoil. The wages would still come due. And the buyout deadline ticked down like a fuse. Caleb found her sitting on the wagon step, the cigar box of the morning's unsold pies beside her, staring at the horizon where the rail line cut its thin gray seam across the world. We could take his offer, Caleb said. He said it kindly, without blame. It's not nothing. It'd clear part of the bank debt. We'd be no worse than when you stepped off the train. We'd be exactly where we were when I stepped off the train, Adeline said, which is 3 seasons from ruin, with 12 men to feed, and a bank that wants its money in spring. She shook her head. Taking his offer doesn't save us, Caleb. It just makes us lose slower. And I told you in this very house that I don't intend to lose slowly. I intend not to lose. Then what? There was no mockery in it. He genuinely wanted to know. That, more than anything, told her how far they'd come. Caleb Hartley asking his wife to find the way out, because he'd come to believe she could. He's holding every card, the camps, the men, the company. We've got 2 wagons of cooling stew in 3 days. Adeline looked at the rail line a long moment. Then something in her face shifted, the way it had the night she'd first read his note about the railroad camp. Not every card, she said. He's forgotten he isn't the only railroad. She had read it weeks ago in a newspaper, Mrs. Sayer used to wrap pies, a notice that a competing line, the Northern and Western, was surveying a route 40 miles south, racing the same season to claim the same federal land grants. At the time, it had meant nothing to her. Now it meant everything. Sloane Company isn't the only outfit laying track this spring, she told Caleb, the papers spreading under her hands again, but with purpose now instead of dread. The Northern and Western has crews south of here. 3 of them, the notice said, and racing the clock. Racing means hungry men working double shifts. And no cook, same as before, because nobody ever thinks of the cook until the cook is gone. Caleb caught up fast. She could see him doing it, the arithmetic of it. You'd switch lines. I'd open negotiations with a company that has every reason to want what Sloane's trying to steal. She was already pulling a clean sheet of paper toward her. Sloane offered me a buyout because my cooking makes crews work faster, and faster crews win the land grants. That's the real value, Caleb. Not the stew, the speed. He knows it. That's why he wants me gone or owned. So I'll go to his competitor and offer them the thing his crews are about to lose. Better fed men, more miles a week, in a race where miles are everything. But it was not so simple, and the next 2 days proved how unsimple. Sloane, hearing through the gossip of the line that the Hartley wagons had turned south, moved to close that door too. He sent a rider with a second message, sweeter than the first. A doubled buyout offer this time, with a clause that would have bound Adeline to never cook for any rail company again. A non-compete, he called it, the words foreign and lawyerly on the prairie wind. Sign, take the money and never feed a railroad crew again as long as she lived. He's frightened, Caleb said, reading the offer over her shoulder. A man doesn't double his price and gag you both unless he's frightened of what you'll do with your mouth open. He's frightened because he did the same arithmetic I did, Adeline said. If the Northern and Western's crews start outpacing his because they're better fed, his bosses will want to know why. He's not protecting the company, he's protecting himself. The deadline was the following dawn. Adeline spent the night writing the most important letter of her life, a proposal to the Northern and Western's regional office, laying out in plain numbers what she'd done for Sloane's crews. The productivity, the morale, the simple math of a hot meal delivered to where the work was. She did not beg, she did not undersell. She wrote as the railroad agent in Omaha had taught her to think, not as a cook offering supper, but as a businesswoman offering an edge in a race worth a fortune in federal land. Tully rode through the dark to put it on the southbound mail train. Mrs. Sayer kept the stoves cold to save the food they could. Old Henry sharpened knives that didn't need sharpening because his hands needed something to do. Pike's sister sang to her children in the bunkhouse, low and steady, and the sound carried across the yard like a thread holding the whole anxious night together. And in the morning, when Sloane's coach came up the road with its brass fittings flashing in the sunrise, Adeline met him on the porch with her arms crossed and Caleb at her shoulder, and she had no answer yet from the south. No telegram, no promise, nothing but a letter on a train and a gamble bigger than any the ranch had ever made. Sloane climbed down smiling, certain of his win. Mrs. Hartley, I trust you've come to your senses. The doubled offer stands until I climb back into this coach. After that, he spread his gloved hands. The price returns to the original sum, and the non-compete remains. Tick, tick. Have you decided? Adeline looked at the empty road behind him, where no southbound rider had yet appeared. She looked at Caleb, who gave the smallest nod. Your call, partner. She looked at the deadline standing on her porch in its expensive coat, and she made the hardest choice of the whole long season. No, Adeline said. I won't sign, Sloane's smile curdled. Then you've ruined yourself. The original offer's withdrawn entirely now. You'll get nothing. Your food spoils, your wages come due, and I'll see to it personally that no company on this line, mine or any other I can reach, does business with the woman who wasted my time. He climbed back into the coach. Sentiment is a luxury for people who can afford it, Mrs. Hartley. You cannot. Good day. The coach rolled out. The road stayed empty, no rider came from the south. The food in the wagons had begun faintly to turn, and the bank's spring deadline, she realized with a cold drop of the heart, was now only weeks away. With the operation dead, the cattle thin, and nothing left to sell, she had gambled the ranch, and the road was empty. She sat on the porch step as the sun climbed, and for the first time since Omaha, Adeline Burke Hartley let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She had taken a man's last cornered hope and spent it on a bet, and the bet had come up empty. 12 hands, Mrs. Sayer, old Henry, Pike's sister, and her 3 children, who'd crossed half the territory on the strength of Adeline's promise of work. All of them depending on a letter sealed on a train that might already have been thrown out with the morning mail by some clerk who'd never heard of her. Caleb came and sat beside her. He didn't speak for a long while. Then he said, when my first wife died, I decided the safest thing a man could do was want nothing. Plant the beans, feed the men, survive the winter, want nothing. 2 years I lived that way. He looked out at the road. You came off that train and made me want things again. A real future. Not just surviving, building, you called it. And I'd rather have wanted that and lost it than gone back to wanting nothing at all. He took her hand. We'll find a way. Or we won't, and we'll start over. But I don't regret the wanting. Not for 1 minute. Adeline pressed her eyes shut against the sting in them. The kindest words she'd ever heard, and they couldn't change the empty road. Then, far to the south, she heard it. A horse running hard. Tully crested the rise at a gallop, hatless, waving a yellow envelope over his head and shouting words the wind tore apart. He hauled the lathered horse to a stop in a spray of dust, and all but fell from the saddle, thrusting the telegram into Adeline's hands. She read it once, her vision blurred. She read it aloud, voice shaking. The Northern and Western accepts the proposal. Full contract. 3 camps to start, more as the line advances. Exclusive catering rights. They want to meet Monday to sign, and they're offering twice the per-plate rate Sloan ever paid. The porch erupted. Old Henry whooped. Caleb laughed, really laughed at last. The road was not empty anymore. Monday came clear and bright, and the Northern and Western did not send a man in a brass-fitted coach. They sent a woman. Her name was Mrs. Vance, and she was the railroad's regional provisioning agent, a sharp-eyed widow in a sensible gray traveling suit who shook Adeline's hand like a man and got straight to business at the long ranch table. "I read your proposal 3 times," she said, spreading her own papers. "I've been begging head office for 2 years to take crew provisioning seriously. Every line treats the cook as an afterthought, and every line loses the race because hungry men dig slow. You're the first person who put numbers to it. Real numbers." She tapped the page. "You wrote like someone who's done the arithmetic." "I have done the arithmetic," Adeline said. "Every line of it, I can see that." Mrs. Vance smiled, a real one, nothing like Sloane's. "So let's make a deal that holds up." They spent the morning at it, and it was the kind of work Adeline had been waiting her whole life to do. Mrs. Vance proposed 3 camps. Adeline countered with a structure that could scale to 6 as the line pushed west, with rates that rose for the remote camps where supply was hardest. Mrs. Vance asked about reliability. Adeline laid out her crew, her wagons, her schedule chalked on the slate, her arrangement with Mrs. Sayer's Bakery and the supply contracts she'd already negotiated. Caleb sat beside her not as a husband supervising a wife, but as a partner watching his partner do the thing she did best. And when Mrs. Vance asked a question about the ranch's capacity to expand its kitchen, it was Caleb who answered, fluently, with figures, because he'd learned them at this same table over these same lamplit nights. By noon they had a contract. Exclusive catering rights to the Northern and Western's Western grading operations, renewable, at a per-plate rate that made the cigar box of the early days look like a child's piggy bank. Mrs. Vance signed first, then slid the paper across. Adeline took up the pen, and then she paused and passed it to Caleb. "Both names," she said. "It's a Hartley operation. It always was. You gave me the kitchen to stand in." Caleb looked at her, and something passed between them that had taken a whole hard season to grow. Not the polite arrangement of 2 strangers joined by a contract from a newspaper, but the genuine article, the thing neither had dared write into their letters. He signed, Caleb Hartley. Adeline Hartley, side by side, the way they'd sat at the table all spring. The news ran up and down the rail line faster than any train. By the end of the week, the story had its own shape in the retelling. How the bride with the frying pan had been squeezed out by the big company and had turned around and handed her business to the big company's rival, doubling her money in the bargain. Foremen who'd been forbidden to buy her stew now heard their own crews grumbling about why they couldn't have the Hartley wagons, and that grumbling, Adeline knew, would do more damage to Sloane than any letter she could write. It did. 3 weeks into the Northern and Western contract, word came down the line that Sloane's superiors had begun asking point questions about why the rival's Southern crews were laying nearly a mile more track per week than his own, and why the difference had appeared at precisely the moment A certain food operation crossed over to the competition. Sloan was reassigned to a depot office in Kansas before the summer was out. He never came up the Bitterroot Road again. Adeline did not gloat. She didn't need to. The numbers had settled the matter, as numbers always did, and she'd learned long ago to let them do the talking. The ranch transformed over that summer in a way none of the 12 hands had believed possible back when they'd called her a bride with a frying pan. The bank debt was cleared in full by midsummer. Caleb rode into Bitterroot Junction and paid the spring note 6 weeks early, and came home that evening with the paid receipt folded in his breast pocket like a love letter. With the catering income steady and growing, they did what the ranch had needed for years and never managed. Bought good breeding stock to rebuild the thin herd, mended the Seguin barn, dug a proper well. The cattle operation that had nearly sunk them became, for the first time, one healthy half of a two-legged business instead of a single fare-filling leg trying to bear the whole weight. And the kitchen. The kitchen became exactly what the agent in Omaha had told Adeline to see. Not a place where supper happened, but a storefront, an engine, the beating heart of an enterprise. Mrs. Sayer ran the bakery side and trained 2 more local widows to keep up with the pie orders. Old Henry presided over a brick oven Caleb built him so his back never had to bend to a camp stove again. Pike's sister became Adeline's right hand at the second wagon, her 3 children growing fat and laughing in a ranch yard that had been silent and grim a season before. Tully, all of 17, managed 3 drivers and a delivery schedule that reached camps 30 miles out, and talked of nothing but next year, and the year after that, because Adeline had taught him there was always a next year worth planning for. On a warm evening in late summer, the whole strange household gathered at the long, scarred table for supper. 12 hands, and the cooks and the children and the widows packed elbow to elbow over a meal so far removed from beans and salt pork that the old days felt like another country. Pike stood, tin cup raised, his weathered face uncharacteristically soft. "I owe a toast," he said. "I called this lady a bride with a frying pan. Thought it was the funniest thing I ever said." He turned the cup in his rough hand. Turns out she had a frying pan, all right, and she beat the railroad with it. The table roared. Pike grinned and lifted the cup higher, to Mrs. Hartley, who saved this ranch before she ever rightly agreed to be part of it. Caleb stood too, and raised his cup beside his neighbor's, and looked down the length of the crowded, laughing table at the woman who had stepped off a train with one trunk and a notion that a kitchen could be more than a kitchen. "To my wife," he said, "my partner both. Best bargain I ever struck. And I didn't even know what I was bargaining for." Adeline laughed and raised her own cup and felt the whole bright future opening out ahead of them like track laid clean across the prairie. Smoke curled from the stovepipe over a kitchen that fed 12 men and earned a small fortune. The same woman stood in the same doorway, but the travel-worn dress was gone, and so was the worry that had counted gaps in the floorboards. The boards were mended now. The ledger on the table showed black ink in every column. Through the window, 2 wagons stood loaded and ready for the dawn run, and beyond them the rebuilt barn caught the last gold light of a prosperous evening. They had bought her to cook. She had built them a future instead, and earned somewhere along the way the one thing no contract had promised and no ledger could measure, a home she had made entirely her own, and a partner glad she had.